Okay, we'll go ahead and reconvene. This is a time for some general question and answer. So folks that maybe haven't had a chance to ask anything yet, if you have questions, for people on Zoom who have a question, if you could write it in the chat, and then we can have somebody take a look at that and answer it as well. But you know, we're a small enough group. I think we can, you know, take hands and we can look at the questions, and then after some time for questions and answer, the fellows will also get a chance to give us the last word for today. Yep.
Thank you all for this wonderful discussion. It's a pleasure. I heard about this in Dick Norbert's talk today here last week when I was contemplating going to the Energy and Resources 50th anniversary where I got my PhD last year. The discussion we had on the side here early on was this question of hope and what we mean by hope and how we define that. And I think the last comments were this thing about having this hopeful vision of the future as a way to think about creating space for perhaps action. To think about like some writings from a Buddhist tradition that I've read, I'm not sure if the specific quote is thinking about Thich Nhat Hanh or the Dalai Lama, but it's this action of mindfulness, right? And there's a critique, I think, in that thinking that is hope distracts us from the mindfulness of the moment and being present now in the action we do now, and the appreciation for the action now and the behavior now. And I think sometimes we get stuck in responding to climate change issues by thinking about the investment in mitigation efforts, the investment in the solar panels, the PV, the planting the trees, and all these other things, because we think that's going to pay off down the line. So this question of hope and action and mindfulness is really challenging. Toby and I had a very brief interaction about this. But this is a question for you all to clarify, what is that definition of hope? And where does that differ by different traditions, sects, like nodding to Sherma's perspective of, you know, all these different forms of theology? Could we ever get to one idea and one definition of what hope is? So that's the question I leave to the group, and thank you so much for this wonderful conversation today. I'm so glad I decided to join.
Oh, well, thanks for the question. It's a good one. Think through. You can think to death like what hope could mean, but I want to offer something that I'm aware of. And it reminds me of my wife's from Germany. I've spent a lot of time over there, and one of the things I reflect on in our tradition, we think about is like how did Nazism happen? And we think about, you know, this thing, right? We go back to some imaginary past, and you know, they live in that fantasy world. But part of what the Nazis were doing was imagining a future. They were looking ahead, and they were excited about technology and building a new Germany, and they got way ahead of themselves, rooted on all kinds of evil and horrible premises. That's just like a little weird way to begin to say. I think part of hope is slowing down and yielding control, because that's really where evil starts. There's a sense of a person or a group saying, I'm above you, I know it's best for you, and now I'm gonna rush into a future that you're not even, I don't see you anymore. So with the earth, maybe we could think of it that way, letting go and living with earth, trusting that all shall be well. That's a hope that on some level letting go. And it strikes a chord with the mystic tradition you were referring to as well. One last point I'll make. Jürgen Moltmann says he promotes the notion of Sabbath rest. And he says we need Sabbath rest, literal and metaphorical Sabbath, because the earth needs a break from us, from industrial humanity, the pressure that we put on it, on its systems, ecosystems, life forms.
Can I add something to your response? So to convince that, like you said, everything shall be good, ultimately, then we should have a kind of eschatological hope.
Mm-hmm.
So, but as you know, the modern cosmology, Big Bang cosmology predicts that our far future will be very different or far from a hope. So how would you respond to the challenge?
Yeah, it's John Polkinger actually says this. The way we can talk about the death of the universe is analogous how we talk about the death of ourselves. The universe has billions of years of life, and we have tens of years.
Right.
But it's in a way, it's an analogous question, it's a similar question.
Right.
And it's kind of to my very point. You can spin out to the future and imagine what a heat death or a cataclysmic implosion might look like. But is that helpful? And is it hopeful? All we have are the choices of how we live now.
Right. But if the universe ended hit that, then there will be no enough transformation. Then you have no way to have hope, even at the current state.
So that's what we know of the physics now. Like, so as a theologian, I just have to say, we don't know what God can do.
Right.
Is it possible, Finland, right? Is it possible that God has a new way of being that we don't even perceive? Is it possible, and is it hopeful?
Hangzhou's gonna do a forum on that in 2 weeks.
What's that?
Hangzhou's gonna do a forum on that in 2 weeks.
Oh,
Yeah, so
that's exciting.
Yeah, you should listen. It's great, this, based on his dissertation, it's absolutely astonishing,
Oh,
yeah, really great work.
I don't know other than to say, I don't really know the answer. That's the mystical kind of honest question. But hope is a mindset, and I think it's about letting go and trusting.
Right, but what I'm arguing is that it's not just a mindset. Of course, mindset is very important, but we have to admit that we have a physical reality, and mind that cannot control the physical reality. So we should focus on the physical reality as the mindset.
Yeah, I agree, yeah. I don't know, you've raised a conundrum. I need to ponder that.
I'm trying to solve the conundrum.
Yeah, I think that's important. Let's keep thinking it through.
Well, and I'll throw economics into that conversation as well, because I think something we're hearing a lot in the United States now is that the children today are not going to be as well off as previous generations were, for perhaps the first time ever. But that is one particular view of an economic reality of what a good life means. And so when you're talking about hope, I'm not sure that we need to have a single answer, because I think that hope can sometimes mean different things for different people. But in general, it seems to be the world or myself being better than it was previously. And I think we can have disagreements about what that looks like and still work towards a world in which all of those possibilities should be possible. And I think it's interesting because the economics of that, I think, is driving the decision. We've also talked about population. Well, people are not having as many children. They might say that it's economic, or maybe they're worried about existential risk of climate change. But that is shaping views of future generations as well. So in terms of what flourishing looks like in the later 21st century, even maybe the 22nd century, we can get there, may not look like what people had hoped for the futurists that were looking at the report of 2000. So yeah, I'm just thinking about the conversation that Richard had with Rita about plurality and unity, and I think I'm siding on Richard in this and saying that I'm not sure that we necessarily need to have one definition of hope that everybody has to hold to, except that I think we can get a broad understanding of what that can look like and work that into a possible vision of the future.
Thank you. Maybe just like one quick process of thinking about it. Like what's coming up from that is this idea of valuation of the present, right? And then it's the time horizon of future generations, or to talk about what Rita said about ancestors and what the responsibility is there versus the future. And so much of our economies are trying to understand, how do we value the present? How do we value the present value of this? And we know that that's very challenging to do. And it's very challenging to do across cultures and across theologies. So those are just some ideas as you're saying that. Maybe it's the question of what that materiality means in the moment where you are, the play space or that one space to have that hope, to have that mindfulness, or however we describe it.
But I think that Toby and Hongju are making good points in that it can't just be the present, that we also have to think about the intergenerational concerns and potentially even the ecological concerns. But yeah, Richard, please.
And then we really need to pay attention to the material conditions which are in the physical realities. The solution is not material. The solution is in organizing socially so that learning is much better distributed. There's much more participatory learning, that there's a much more of a discursive democracy, that there's much more of a sense of trust and relations between people, and a sense of relation with nature. And in many ways, these are not material things. These are mindsets which are relational. And this, I know material and relations are interrelated, but I think shifting relationality and shared understanding, and that the meaning of life can just be the process of learning together, constantly upgrading and sharing, rather than consuming. That, you know, I have weird academic ideas because learning has been so important to me. But I can imagine a world in which learning and sharing is much more widely spread. And that we spend our time doing that rather than possessing. So the solution is not material, even though the problem we have generated is material.
There's Toby made a comment about the poverty leading to degradation, environmental degradation, and then there's the juxtaposition of that, which is that, you know, power and material wealth leads to that same type of environmental degradation. So, you know, I don't know if you had a comment on that. Are those two separate things? Because we're talking about materiality and poverty, and then the definition of poverty ends up coming up.
Let me appeal to Arturo Escobar, who was mentioned by Rita. That Arturo wrote a critique of development in which he argued very strongly that it's the rich nations that have defined the unrich nations, materially unrich nations, as being impoverished. And a lot of that impoverishedness has been created by the demands that the modern economy puts on us and puts on other peoples, rather than the cultural respect that everybody deserves. And in my own experience living in Brazil, the richness of a shared culture of a middle class and poor people getting in the streets and dancing in carnival is a cultural sharedness which is extremely important to the identity of Brazil, and it's still going on. And they're not impoverished, we're impoverished. So we have to use this word poverty carefully.
Richard had wrote a paper called Finding Hope in the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment that I read when I was in the doctoral program. And they were, what I recall from this, correct me if I'm getting this wrong, it's just pondering, thinking and stressing about this grim data. But as I recall, you said the greatest hope you found was in the conversations that happened when scholars across disciplines would go and get a cup of coffee or just take a walk and somehow find common ground in spite of their differences. And I sometimes wonder if the differences themselves are a bit of an illusion. They alienate us from our common humanity for things that really matter. There's a great quote from David Tracy I remember reading again as a doctoral student. Conflict is our actuality. Conversation is our hope. Right. And there is hope in that, just like the discourse of people and ideas and culture and love. That's hopeful.
And say it again in a good way.
What
Was it good again? Sorry.
the quote?
Yeah, say it again.
Conflict is our actuality. conversation is our hope. So. Gadamer asked.
Gadamer, yeah,
Yeah.
concur.
Well, that sounds like Christian hope to me, but I was gonna ask Mr. Theologian here, Ted, what is Christian hope?
Christian hope derives from the vision we have of the kingdom of God or the new creation that God has promised us. And if you heard my quotation from Bob Russell, it's confirmed in the resurrection of Jesus that God can and will provide the healing of all things. So if God has the power to do that, then we have every reason to be hopeful about the problems that we want solved.
So that sounds like God is our future. I mean, we're talking about the future, not
I think that's a really good way to say that. God is our future.
You know, you should write a book entitled that.
I think I read it already.
Well, and the anamnesis of Eucharist, Christ has died, Christ is risen, Christ will come again.
Yes,
We declare that
yes.
on a weekly, I celebrate the Eucharist every week.
Yep.
Well, we don't always see it. We don't see hope, so the data can be grim, but we can still have hope. Because the hope isn't derived from the data itself. It's a greater story. It's like a lot of this is one of the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves
Yes.
and the planet we live on.
Yes, well, I think when I say the phrase Christ is risen, I'm thinking of the expressions of that. In right here and now, like the mindfulness, the compassion, the empathy, and I always thought that USAID was an expression of Christian hope. And, you know, people sometimes toss around the idea that this is a Christian nation. Well, in my opinion, it was a Christian nation in the way it acted toward other people on the planet, like USAID. And sure, there was enlightened self-interest in that, but still, we were really helping people and lifting people out of death and poverty, which is what the Christian message is. So that to me was an expression of Christian hope. And I see the risen Christ all over the place, all the things that happen that never make the news. But there's so much good stuff that's happening in this world. And so I have a lot of hope that people who follow goodness or mindfulness or the living Christ will be expressing that in their actions.
Yeah, there are some Christian virtue folks who think that hope is a subset of faith, and that it's a subset of the virtue of faith, and that it's faith in the future and faith in God's ability to bring about the future, particularly under the new creation or beatification, however you might want to say it. But I think that again, from the Jews' question, then we can imagine that in the short term. But science does seem to give us a question of what does that look like in the long term. But in that view, the Earth has already been unsustainable for life, even without human action. I mean, at some point, the planet's going to become inhabitable anyway as the sun goes through its own death cycle. So I think there's a lot of cosmological steps even in between, the current climate crisis and the far death of the universe. But
And my question is then, if we assume that the demise of Earth in several million years will be the ultimate future of our universe or humanity, then would anyone be able to hold their hope? Because the hope comes from the resurrection of Jesus, Christian hope. And if the hope of the resurrection of Jesus Christ is true, then we have to expect that our universe should be redeemed, salvation. So following the resurrection of Jesus. So if we cannot avoid assuming that our universe would end up with a heat death or our also be demise, then how can we maintain our hope based on the resurrection of Jesus? Actually, that has been my research.
Well said.
Come to your forum.
Yes.
Well, I think that is a good point to wrap up general conversation. Thank you very much. And I think we're doing. The time is forward. So, you know, please come on up, and if there's any last words of wisdom or hope that you wish to impart, we'd love to hear them.
Being able to think through possible solutions, but just knowing that there are other people that actually care matters, makes a difference, and we can see hope in the face of others. And we say in the Christian faith, we're created in the image and likeness of God. So hope springs eternal, and but events like this are a helpful little marker along the way. So I thank you again for the opportunity, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you, Dan.
Very thankful to have spent the afternoon with you, to have heard so much constructive and interesting and supportive and feedback. Thank you for welcoming an economist. Of course, I am an ecological economist, but an economist, I'm a heretic economist. But still, to be open to the accusations I made. I was deliberately maybe more evocative than a longer paper, a longer talk would have been. But I'm just grateful for the reception and elaboration. Yeah, thank you.